Thomas Miller sat on the cold pavement of downtown Seattle, his worn green beret resting on the cardboard box beside him, when the lawyer in the expensive suit stopped and said his name, a name Thomas hadn't heard spoken with such formality in over 7 years. The lawyer had been searching for him for 6 months, tracking him through shelters and soup kitchens, following leads from fellow veterans who remembered a decorated green beret who had fallen through society's cracks. But nothing could have prepared Thomas for what the lawyer was about to tell him, and absolutely nothing could have prepared him for what he would discover in the crumbling mansion he was about to inherit from a woman he barely remembered. Thomas was 53 years old, though his weathered face and the deep lines carved by years of sleeping rough made him look closer to 70. He'd served 22 years in the military, including 3 tours with the Green Berets, earning commendations for valor that now meant nothing more than stories he occasionally shared with other homeless veterans around barrel fires. His descent into homelessness hadn't been dramatic or sudden. It had been a slow erosion, like a cliff face gradually crumbling into the sea. First, there was the divorce after his final deployment, when his wife admitted she couldn't live with the stranger he'd become. Then the struggle to hold down civilian jobs when his PTSD made every loud noise a potential threat and every crowded room an ambush waiting to happen. Then the lost apartment, the empty bank account, and finally the street corner where he'd been sitting for the past 3 years. Mr. Miller? Thomas Miller, formerly Sergeant First Class with the United States Army Special Forces? The lawyer's voice cut through Thomas's mental fog, pulling him back to the present moment. Thomas looked up, squinting against the afternoon sun. "That's me. What's this about? I haven't done anything wrong." The lawyer, whose name was Jonathan Pierce, crouched down to Thomas's level, seemingly unconcerned about his expensive suit touching the dirty pavement. "Mr. Miller, I represent the estate of Margaret Blackwood. Does that name mean anything to you?" Thomas's mind worked slowly, pushing through the haze of exhaustion and malnutrition. Margaret Blackwood. The name triggered something, a distant memory from decades ago. Mrs. Blackwood? From Germany? When I was stationed there in the early 90s. That's correct. You saved her grandson's life during a training accident near the base. A teenager who had wandered onto the range. The memory came flooding back with sudden clarity. Thomas had been 25, newly assigned to a base in Germany. During a training exercise, a local teenager, curious about the military operations, had somehow bypassed security and wandered onto an active artillery range. Thomas had spotted him and sprinted across the field, tackling the boy just seconds before a shell landed where he'd been standing. The grandmother, Margaret Blackwood, had been a British woman married to a German businessman. She'd come to the base to thank Thomas personally, tears streaming down her face as she held his hands and told him he'd saved not just her grandson but her entire family's future. "I remember her," Thomas said quietly. "But that was over 30 years ago. Why are you looking for me now?" Jonathan Pierce opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "Mrs. Blackwood passed away 6 months ago at the age of 97. In her will, she left specific instructions that you were to inherit her property in England, a house in the countryside outside of Bath. She spent the last years of her life trying to locate you to thank you again and to ensure you were taken care of, but you'd become difficult to find." Thomas stared at the lawyer, certain this was some kind of elaborate joke or scam. People like him didn't inherit houses in England. People like him inherited empty bottles and worn-out blankets from other homeless people who died in their sleep. "You're saying she left me a house? Why would she do that?" "Because you saved her grandson's life, and because she learned about your circumstances and wanted to help. The house has been vacant for several years. Mrs. Blackwood spent her final years in a care facility, but it's legally yours now, along with a modest sum for taxes and basic maintenance. There are conditions, of course. You must go to England, take possession of the property, and live there for at least 1 year. After that, you're free to do with it as you wish." Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. "What's the catch? This sounds too good to be true." "No catch, Mr. Miller. Just one elderly woman's way of saying thank you and giving you a second chance. The question is, are you ready to accept it?" 3 weeks later, after a whirlwind of paperwork, a medical checkup at a veterans clinic, and a flight that felt surreal for someone who hadn't been on a plane in over a decade, Thomas stood in front of the house that was apparently now his. The mansion loomed before him like something from a Gothic novel, its Victorian architecture both magnificent and menacing. The windows were dark and dusty, the garden overgrown with weeds that reached up to swallow the crumbling stone pathway, and the entire structure seemed to sag under the weight of years of neglect. The lawyer had warned him it was in poor condition, but seeing it in person was different. This wasn't just an abandoned house, it was a testament to decay, a monument to time's relentless march. Thomas had been given keys, basic supplies, and enough money to cover his needs for several months. The local solicitor who'd met him at the airport had been kind but businesslike, explaining that the utilities had been reconnected and the house was structurally sound despite its appearance. Thomas pushed open the heavy front door, which groaned on rusty hinges, and stepped into the entrance hall. Dust particles danced in the shafts of light that penetrated the grimy windows. The air smelled of old wood, damp stone, and decades of isolation. He stood there for a long moment, his military training automatically cataloging the space, exits, sight lines, potential hazards, before he reminded himself that this was his home now, not a combat zone. The house was enormous, with more rooms than one person could possibly need. As Thomas began his exploration, moving from room to room with the methodical precision of his military training, he found remnants of lives lived long ago. There was furniture covered in white sheets, paintings on walls depicting landscapes and portraits of stern-faced ancestors, and shelves filled with books whose pages had yellowed with age. In the kitchen, ancient appliances stood like relics from another era. The whole place felt frozen in time, as if the inhabitants had simply walked out one day and never returned. It was in the library on the second floor that Thomas found the first clue that this house held more than just memories. The room was lined with bookshelves that reached from floor to ceiling, and in the center stood a large mahogany desk. On the desk was an envelope with his name written in elegant cursive. Thomas opened it with trembling hands and found a letter from Margaret Blackwood. "Dear Thomas," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then my prayers have been answered and you have been found. I have thought of you often over the years, the brave young soldier who saved my Heinrich without hesitation or thought for his own safety. When I learned of your circumstances several years ago, my heart broke. A man who gave so much for others deserved better than what life had given you. This house is my gift to you, but it is also my final request. There is something here that needs to be found, something that needs to be brought into the light. I have left clues throughout the house, a treasure hunt of sorts, because I know that a man of your skills and determination will not rest until he has uncovered the truth. Trust your instincts, Thomas. Look beyond what is obvious. And know that in giving you this house, I am not just repaying a debt, I am entrusting you with a sacred duty. With gratitude and hope, Margaret Blackwood." Thomas read the letter 3 times, his curiosity overwhelming his exhaustion. A treasure hunt? A sacred duty? What could possibly be hidden in this decaying mansion that was so important? His military training had taught him to solve puzzles, to see patterns others missed, to never give up on a mission. This was a mission now, his first real purpose in years. He began systematically searching the library, looking for anything unusual. The letter had said to look beyond the obvious, so Thomas forced himself to think differently. He examined the bookshelves, pulling out volumes at random, checking for hidden compartments. He studied the paintings on the walls, looking for safes or hollow spaces behind them. He tapped on walls, listening for the hollow sound that might indicate a hidden room. It was when he noticed that one particular book, a weathered copy of Treasure Island, was positioned slightly differently from the others, jutting out about an inch, that he found the first real clue. Thomas pulled the book, and with a soft click, a section of the bookshelf swung inward, revealing a narrow passageway that led into darkness. His heart racing with an excitement he hadn't felt in years, Thomas grabbed the flashlight the solicitor had provided and entered the passage. It was dusty and filled with cobwebs, clearly unused for decades. The passage led to a small room that had been completely hidden from the main house. Inside, Thomas found something that took his breath away: walls covered with photographs, documents, and maps, all related to World War II. As Thomas studied the materials with growing fascination, a story began to emerge. Margaret Blackwood, it seemed, had not just been a wealthy woman living in Germany. During World War II, she had been part of a resistance network, helping Allied soldiers escape from Nazi-occupied territory. The photographs showed a younger Margaret with various men in military uniforms, the documents were coded messages and safe house locations, and the maps traced escape routes through Germany and into neutral countries. But there was something else, something that made Thomas's chest tighten with emotion. Among the photographs was one of a young woman, no more than 16, standing next to Margaret. The caption on the back, written in faded ink, read, "Sarah, 1944. The bravest soul I ever knew." Thomas found a journal on a small desk in the hidden room, and as he opened it and began to read Margaret's words from over 75 years ago, he understood why this room existed and why he had been chosen to find it. October 15, 1944, the first entry read, "Today we lost Sarah. She was caught by the Gestapo while guiding 3 American pilots to the safe house in Frankfurt. They say she didn't break under interrogation, didn't reveal any names or locations. She was only 16 years old, and she died protecting us all. I made her a promise before she left on that final mission. If she didn't come back, I would make sure the world knew what she did, that her sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten. But the war ended, and in the chaos of rebuilding in my own cowardice, I kept this room locked. I told myself it was too dangerous to speak of these things, that old wounds should be left to heal. But wounds don't heal in darkness, they fester. Sarah deserves better. The world deserves to know." Thomas sat in that hidden room for hours, reading through decades of journal entries. Margaret had carried the guilt of her silence for her entire life. She had wanted to tell Sarah's story, to ensure the young woman's heroism was recognized, but fear and circumstances had always prevented her. The entries became less frequent over the years, but the theme remained constant. A promise unfulfilled, a debt unpaid, a hero forgotten. The final entry was dated just 2 years before Margaret's death. "I am old now, and my time is running short. I failed Sarah, but perhaps I can make one final attempt to honor her memory. I have decided to leave this house and this room to someone who understands sacrifice and duty." Thomas Miller saved Heinrich without hesitation, asking nothing in return. He is a soldier who has fallen on hard times, but I believe he still has the heart of a hero. If he finds this room, if he reads these words, perhaps he will do what I could not, bring Sarah's story into the light and ensure her sacrifice is remembered. Thomas closed the journal, tears streaming down his face. This wasn't just about a house or a treasure hunt, it was about honoring a promise and giving voice to the voiceless. Sarah had been 16 years old when she died protecting Allied soldiers and resistance workers. She had no grave, no monument, no recognition. Her family probably never even knew what had happened to her, might have spent decades wondering why she never came home. But Thomas knew what to do. This was his mission now, as clear and defined as any he'd received in the military. He would tell Sarah's story. He would make sure the world knew what she had done. Over the following weeks, Thomas threw himself into the task with an intensity he hadn't felt since his military days. He cleaned the house, working methodically through each room, restoring order to chaos. The physical labor was therapeutic, giving him purpose and structure. He contacted historians specializing in World War II resistance movements, sharing the documents and photographs he'd found. He reached out to archives and museums, offering to donate the materials so they could be properly preserved and studied. The response was overwhelming. Historians were fascinated by Margaret's collection, which provided new insights into resistance networks that had operated in Germany during the war. Several researchers traveled to the house to examine the hidden room and its contents. News organizations picked up the story, and suddenly Thomas found himself at the center of a growing movement to recognize forgotten heroes of World War II. But finding out what happened to Sarah and who she really was became Thomas's personal obsession. Using the clues in Margaret's journals, mentions of the town where Sarah lived, descriptions of her family, dates and locations, Thomas worked with genealogists and historians to trace her identity. It took months of painstaking research, following leads that often went nowhere, But Thomas never gave up. He'd been trained to complete missions, and this was the most important mission of his life. Finally, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. An elderly man in Munich, after seeing news coverage of the hidden room discovery, contacted Thomas through the museum that was helping coordinate the research. His name was Heinrich Blackwood, the same Heinrich whose life Thomas had saved 30 years ago. "I need to tell you something about my grandmother," Heinrich said during their video call, his English heavily accented but clear. "She never stopped trying to find Sarah's family. In her final years, she hired investigators, searched through records, but the war had destroyed so much documentation. However, she did discover something, and she left instructions that if anyone ever found the hidden room, they should be given this information." Heinrich sent Thomas a file that Margaret had compiled near the end of her life. Sarah's full name had been Sarah Rosenberg. She had been Jewish, which made her resistance work even more dangerous. If caught, she faced not just execution as a spy but deportation to concentration camps. Her family had been deported in 1943, and most had perished. But Sarah had been hidden by Margaret's network, and she had chosen to use her relative's safety to help save others. The file also contained something precious: a location. Before her death, Sarah had been buried in a small cemetery on the outskirts of Frankfurt by members of the resistance who retrieved her body at great personal risk. Her grave was unmarked, just a plot number in the cemetery records, but it existed. Thomas traveled to Germany, his first time back in the country since his military service. Heinrich met him there, and together they went to the cemetery. Standing at the unmarked grave of a 16-year-old girl who had died 78 years ago, Thomas finally understood the full scope of Margaret's gift to him. "My grandmother saved my life twice," Heinrich said quietly as they stood in the cemetery. "Once when she kept me safe during the war, and once when you pulled me from that artillery range. She taught me that we all have the power to save each other, in ways large and small. By leaving you that house, by giving you this mission, she was saving you too, wasn't she?" Thomas nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Margaret had known that he needed more than just shelter. He needed purpose, a reason to live, a mission to complete. She had given him all of that in the form of a promise unfulfilled and a hero forgotten. With Heinrich's help and funding from several historical societies and veterans organizations that had been moved by the story, Thomas arranged for a proper memorial to be placed at Sarah's grave. The ceremony was small but dignified, attended by historians, veterans, and representatives from Jewish organizations. A simple stone now marked the spot, engraved with Sarah's name, her dates, and a phrase Thomas had found in one of Margaret's journal entries: "She gave everything so others might be free." But that wasn't the end of Thomas's mission. He returned to England, to the house that was now truly his home, and he made a decision. The hidden room would become a memorial, a small museum dedicated not just to Sarah but to all the forgotten heroes of resistance movements during World War II. He would open it to researchers, to students, to anyone who wanted to learn about the ordinary people who had done extraordinary things. The transformation of both the house and Thomas himself was remarkable. As he restored the mansion room by room, he was simultaneously rebuilding his own life. Veterans organizations, inspired by his story, reached out to offer support. He began speaking at events about his journey from homelessness to purpose, emphasizing that it's never too late to find meaning in life, that everyone deserves a second chance, and that sometimes our greatest missions come when we least expect them. Other homeless veterans started reaching out to him, and Thomas realized he had a new purpose beyond just maintaining Sarah's memory. He began using part of the house as a temporary shelter for veterans who were transitioning off the streets, giving them a safe place to stay while they got back on their feet. He called it Sarah's House, explaining to everyone who asked that Sarah had given her life to provide safety for others, and this was a way to continue her legacy. 1 year after inheriting the house, on the anniversary of his arrival, Thomas sat in the library where he'd found Margaret's first letter. The house was transformed, clean, warm, and filled with life. 3 veterans were currently staying in guest rooms, working on their recovery and rebuilding their lives. The hidden room had been professionally restored and was scheduled to open to the public next month. Heinrich was coming from Germany for the opening ceremony, bringing members of Sarah's extended family who had survived the war. Thomas pulled out a journal he'd started keeping, inspired by Margaret's example. He wanted to document this journey, this transformation, so that someday, someone might understand how a crumbling house and a forgotten hero had saved his life just as surely as he'd once saved a teenage boy on a training range. "Dear Margaret," he wrote, "I found what you left for me. I found Sarah's story, and I found my purpose. You gave me more than a house. You gave me a reason to live, a mission to complete, and a reminder that it's never too late to make a difference. Sarah's sacrifice will be remembered. Her story will be told. And in telling it, I found my own story again. Thank you for seeing something in me that I'd forgotten was there. Thank you for believing that a homeless veteran could be entrusted with such a sacred duty. I won't let you down. I won't let Sarah down. This house will stand as a testament to the power of second chances, to the importance of remembering heroes, and to the truth that we are all connected across time by acts of courage and compassion." As Thomas sealed the journal entry, he heard voices from downstairs, the veterans he was helping, preparing dinner together in the kitchen. The sound of life and laughter filled the house that had been silent for so long. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, from a street corner in Seattle to this mansion in England, from hopelessness to purpose, from isolation to community. The truth that nobody could have imagined wasn't just what Thomas found inside the house, it was what he found inside himself. Margaret Blackwood had known what she was doing when she left him this inheritance. She hadn't just given him property, she'd given him a mission that would require him to become the man he once was, the soldier who never gave up, the hero who saved lives without thinking of the cost. And in completing that mission, in bringing Sarah's story to light and transforming the house into a place of healing and remembrance, Thomas had saved one more life, his own. That was the real treasure hidden in the abandoned mansion, the discovery that changed everything. Sometimes the greatest inheritances aren't measured in money or property but in purpose and second chances, in the opportunity to honor the past while building a better future. Thomas stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden he'd been gradually restoring. Spring was coming, and soon the land would bloom again, just as his life had bloomed. Somewhere in Germany, Sarah's grave now had a stone to mark her sacrifice. Somewhere in his soul, Thomas had found peace and purpose again. And in this house, this beautiful, restored mansion that had once been as broken as he was, life continued. Proof that nothing is ever too far gone to be saved, that no one is ever too lost to be found, and that the most profound discoveries we make are often the ones we make about ourselves.